On behalf of the Sovereign Order of Malta, Permanent Observer Mission to the United Nations in New York, permit me to extend New Year's greetings to our UN colleagues and to members and friends of the Order of Malta in New York and around the world. I want to share with you today a discussion we initiated following the COP26 climate change meetings in Glasgow, Scotland last November. While many voices were heard at these meetings and many articulate and profound sentiments and aspirations were shared, perhaps not enough attention was paid to the views of young people, the youth of our world, those who will ultimately, for better or for worse, inherit the climate and environmental problems that our generation and previous generations have left, and as some people call, a legacy of shame. Please listen to what these young people have to say as they discuss the impact and the consequences of COP26. We have brought together a group of people who represent a range of countries, cultures, and perspectives. But they have one thing in common. They all share a passionate commitment to a world and to an environment that needs to be saved. Please hear them out, to their concerns and their hopes.
Welcome to the first youth panel in the margins of the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. My name is BETÜL YÜRÜK. It is my pleasure to moderate this first youth panel hosted by the Sovereign Order of Malta Permanent Observer Mission to the United Nations in New York. Today we'll be discussing climate change and how to protect our planet with young advocates and delegates. Here with me we have Daniel Del Valle Blanco, Youth Delegate for the Sovereign Order of Malta, SOFIA, PIECUCH, Director of Advocacy at the World Youth Alliance, GAIA REYES, the Youth Delegate from the United Kingdom, CYNTHIA, UNA USA Youth Observer to the United Nations. Our planet is changing before our eyes, from ravaging wildfires to melting glaciers, floods, droughts, and the list goes on. We're digging our graves, were the words of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, giving a stark warning on climate change at COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. We also heard world leaders and their commitments to stop climate change. Now it is time to hear from young people. To start this off, let me turn to our panelists. Daniel, let's begin with you. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what your take is from COP26?
Thank you so much, BETÜL. And it is a real pleasure to be here today speaking with all of you, young people so prepared and with a very big passion for our future. And thanks to the Sovereign Order of Malta, to the United Nations, for organizing this important meeting and this important discussion. Myself, I'm Daniel, as you said, and I'm working right now as a political advisor of the ambassador of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations. But I was working also with the ambassador of Slovakia to the United Nations too, as his youth advisor. And I was involved also with the Youth Envoy of the United Nations. And at the same time, right now, I'm High Representative for Youth of the International Human Rights Foundation of Spain. So basically, these are my commitments right now. I'm working, of course, to give a big voice to the young people around the world. So yeah, and about the COP26, that's really interesting. You know, the leaders of the world have convened in Glasgow 2 weeks ago to answer one fundamental question: how to reconcile environmental protection with economic development. Can we ensure socioeconomic growth and at the same time safeguard our planet for future generations? That's a good question, right? At COP26, we have seen some very important developments which certainly show us how climate change has become a significant priority for all member states and various global organizations. And I will be direct. I believe that the conversations carried out during the Glasgow conference have been very successful. And I'm not referring exclusively to the conclusions and agreement that have been reached, but also to the enormous promotion of sustainable values that are turning the world around. But I also have to be realistic. The truth is that we must be more radical in our strategy for climate action. A clear example is that in the COP26 agreement, it has been recognized that coal is a culprit of the climate crisis, but only commits to its gradual decrease. And I think that if we want to be, in capital letters, real ambassadors of change, we cannot be over diplomatic and fragile in the procedures we must take. A real change, for my point of view, is to eliminate carbon, not to reduce it. Perhaps the most important change is the wording that asks parties to come to next year's COP27 in Egypt with updated plans on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The developed states had previously agreed that each of them would contribute $100 billion annually from 2020, something that has not been achieved. The Glasgow Climate Pact includes a doubling of adaptation funds by 2025 from 2019 levels, which represents progress in this area. However, the $100 billion target remains unmet and is likely to be achieved just in 2023. And I have here the graphic that shows us how it's going to be achieved just in 2023. And I think it's terrific because the state's commitment were to achieve it in 2020. And this was according to a report of the COP26 presidency. There are also questions about whether developed nations can even maintain that level of funding annually. Climate crisis intensifies vulnerabilities and inequalities and risks the well-being of humanity. The increasing occurrence of natural disaster, loss of agricultural land, deteriorating health due to pollution and biodiversity loss, as well as emerging conflicts over water resources, show that climate is without doubt a peace and security issue. The COP26, and I'm going to finish with this, is not only a conference on climate, but I think it's also a conference on peace.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me turn to Sofia. Why don't you introduce yourself, Sofia, and tell us what your thoughts are on COP26.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm Sofia PIECUCH, and I am the new Director of Advocacy at World Youth Alliance. We're an organization that through education, culture, and advocacy, we seek to really make known human dignity and elevate the dignity of the person, and to really empower young people to be voices, advocacy voices for human dignity at the global stage. And so we have regional offices in all continents, and I'm very blessed to be now in a position where I'm the official liaison between World Youth Alliance and the United Nations, and I have colleagues that do the same at the European Union and the Organization of American States. And so it's very great to be amongst youth because usually sometimes I'm the only young person in the room. So this is wonderful. Thank you for your question about COP26. I think in all of these meetings, it's fair to say that it's hard to come out with everything that we want from these meetings, and it's very easy to be also disappointed. So there are a couple of things I think we can highlight, and there are a couple of things that personally I was disappointed about. I think the global methane pledge, I think that was something that lowering methane levels down 30%. I think that's a success, and I think it's something that can be achieved. The push to cut fossil fuel subsidies, I think this is also, I think it was one of the first times that fossil fuel was even brought up at COP, and so I'm glad that that is on the table. Yes, you mentioned coal. I know at the last minute there was a little change. Instead of phasing out coal, phase down coal. I'm glad there is at least a movement to phase down coal, but it would have been really amazing if they kept the phase out. And then the big push to end deforestation. And I think the fact that Brazil is part of the countries that was saying yes, like we are committed to this plan, especially because the world's biggest lake is located in Brazil. So I think these are things that, they're not perfect victories, but I think there are victories there. I think my biggest source of disappointment came on behalf of the G77. I think you mentioned as well there was this lack of funding that was promised, $100 billion to help them move into to achieve these goals that are being set at these climate conferences. And so, there was no funding for loss and damage, even though that was on the agenda. At the end, no funding was set there. There was the $40 billion for climate adaptation, but this, again, is a very small amount. So my question is, there are these big goals and they're wonderful, but there really needs to be more support for the G77 to achieve these goals. So that's what I would say are my first.
All right, thanks,
initial
Sophia.
impressions.
And let me turn to Gaia. Gaia, you attended the UN COP21 Paris Climate Conference in 2015. And if we look at COP26, according to Paris Agreement architects who drafted the deal, COP26 targets are too weak to limit global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Also, we heard youth activist Greta Thunberg. She said it's a failure, and as we all know, blah, 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 about COP26. Let's know who Gaia is and what your take is from COP26.
Sure. Firstly, it's an honor to be with such an incredible panel, and I'd like to say thank you to the Permanent Mission of the Sovereign Order of Malta, to the UN, for hosting this discussion. As a brief introduction, my name is GAIA REYES, and I'm the UK Youth Delegate to the G20, focusing on the Italian presidency's track of digitalization, innovation, and the future of work. I also work as a consultant in the Executive Director's Office of UN Women, which is the UN entity for gender equality, and I'm also a young advisor to Chatham House, which is a leading London-based policy institute. So regarding your question on COP21 and comparing it with COP26, I think for COP26, the ultimate benchmark of success was whether governments could come together to limit greenhouse gas emissions to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement. And we could see that the urgency of this threshold was stressed by the recent IPCC report, which called it a code red for humanity. So this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal was barely achieved. It was achieved, but it still ultimately hinges on whether governments can keep on the promises, on the pledges, and on the commitments in the run-up to the Egypt COP in COP27. So we saw some progress, as was mentioned before, such as protection of oceans, biodiversity, and pledges for deforestation by 2030. We saw commitments on coal, which, while diluted in language, are still the first global climate agreement on coal since the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. But I think ultimately it's still a very disappointing result. It's incremental. It's not nearly ambitious enough to combat the gravity of the issue, and it's just far too slow. So we can't be waiting on progress to be made. We need to see it now. So even if the new nationally determined contributions are fully implemented, this still just puts us on the course for a warming of 2.4 degrees, which is far above the Paris Agreement of 1.5. You mentioned Greta Thunberg, and I sympathize greatly with youth activists who call for more ambitious action. Alongside Greta Thunberg, there were many young women activists from the Global South who were instrumental in highlighting the stark shortcomings that come with compromise and consensus building. So Mitzi Janelle Tan from the Philippines, Vanessa Nakate, who is a Ugandan climate activist, and Elizabeth Wathuti from Kenya, just to name a few. And ultimately, I don't think we should measure success merely by the words on paper, but by the ability of the countries to provide, to strengthen, to implement, and to deliver on the promises and the commitments they made.
I'd like to turn to Cynthia now. Cynthia, why don't you tell us about yourself and your take from COP26 and what steps can be taken to fight climate change?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, BETÜL, for the wonderful question. And I'd also like to say it's such an honor to share the stage with y'all and be with so many other dedicated youth leaders. And thank you to the Permanent Mission of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations for hosting this event. So my name is Cynthia Yu. I'm the U.S. Youth Observer to the United Nations, appointed by the UNA USA, which is the United Nations Association of the United States of America. I've also previously spent the last 7 years with UNICEF and UNICEF USA, most recently as their youth ambassador to the 74th General Assembly. I have also previously worked as a fellow for sustainability and youth empowerment and deliberation initiatives with the Embassy of France in the United States and the Ministry of Tourism of the Republic of Indonesia. So in terms of my thoughts on COP26, I agree wholeheartedly with what Sophia said, which is that there's good and there's bad, but we definitely need to hold our leaders more accountable, and there's so much more that's left to be done. So I'll start with the good, which is that COP26 represented an initiative that united our entire world together and brought together people from everywhere to speak about an imminent issue that is challenging everybody everywhere. It brought together people from across the globe to unite together to serve as forces for change on climate action. And most importantly, there were tangible steps that came out of COP26 to hold nations accountable for their emissions. So for example, as an improvement to Paris, it was discussed that they would review their annual ambitions every year instead of every 5 years. And there were so many other actions taken to increase transparency on the government and private sector sides of holding emissions and keeping emissions in check. That being said, I think that there's so much more work to be done, and I think that one thing that could have been done better is the inclusion of more youth voices at the table and more civil society members. There were over 20,000 people who attended Glasgow in person, and while it wasn't anybody's fault, there were things that are out of people's control, it was very hard to include all 20,000 people into the room at the same time. And more importantly, unfortunately, it ended up being that young activists of color, BIPOCs, and people who are from underrepresented and marginalized communities weren't able to have the same voice as white activists. And so we see these disparities that are existing even when we bring people to the table. I also want to highlight how important it is to just include youth in general, because we are the leaders and at the forefront of the climate activism movement. And I think that that is exemplified so well in that during COP26, thousands of young people and just attendees in general ended up marching outside the halls because they saw that there was more work that needed to be done. They saw that it didn't just end at the walls or at the door, it had to transcend beyond the halls of COP26. And so in terms of what we can continue doing to serve as leaders for this great movement, we must hold our leaders accountable. We can't let them stop at the door, and we have to call out when they aren't living up to their promises. As Greta Thunberg said, blah, blah, blah. I think that the marches that happened outside of COP26 exemplify how our generation is taking that torch and leading it forward and pushing forward the ideals that we need to create a better planet and a better future.
Thank you, Cynthia. Now let's look at the facts and what science tells us. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, with current pledges, the world is still on track for an average 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise, and scientists warn that if global temperatures rise by more than 1.5 degrees, the Earth is likely to be unlivable for millions of people. At COP26, Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley said that 2 degrees of global warming is death sentence for millions of people on island states. Daniel, I want to come back to you. What is the most urgent step to take, and where do we start?
Yeah, thank you. I need to start by saying that Prime Minister Mia Mottley is actually an exceptional leader. It's great that she talks about things that they really are, including the recent general debate of the UN General Assembly. Her speeches, as you know, have gone viral, and people all around the world, especially young people, listen to her and appreciate her messages and her focused leadership. especially that she's a woman from a small island Caribbean state speaking, and her country is directly affected by climate change. There are, in my opinion, two urgent steps that we need to take. First one is to invest in adaptation, and second one is to invest in mitigation. Adaptation finance is needed in order to address the reversible damage that has already been done and that would continue to happen for a couple more decades, even if we stopped all emissions right now. Small island developing states, at least developed countries, need urgent assistance in building resilient infrastructure, sanitation systems, agriculture, housing, and so forth. Developed countries have pledged to provide, as I mentioned before, $100 billion every year for climate finance. But this goal still hasn't been met, and in the following years, the estimated cost of adaptation will continue to increase. The first urgent step would therefore be to provide more funds for climate adaptation and smart green economy solutions. Today, developed countries see rich countries spending an extra $20 trillion or so on their own economies in response to COVID-19, but then failing to honor their promise dating for COP15 in 2009 to mobilize the $100 billion per year for climate action in developed countries. I have recently read that the Climate Adaptation Fund, established to help developing countries to meet their adaptation needs, collected all of its $356 million in pledges at COP26. It is about 5 cents per person in the worst developing countries. And regarding financing for losses and damages, that is, to recover and rebuild for climate disasters, have ended even worse. Rich countries agreed only to hold a dialogue on this issue. And of course, this has to change. For example, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, who currently serves as SDG advocate for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is proposing to levy each high-income country $5 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and upper middle-income countries $2.5 per ton. And also that these levies should rise gradually, doubling in 5 years. High-income countries currently emit around 12 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, and upper middle-income countries are emitting around 16 billion tons annually. It's a disaster. Trust needs to be rebuilt among countries, and not only among the rich and the poor ones. This is an important job for diplomacy, but also for young people like us, and for decision makers and influencers, including UN goodwill envoys, as for example Leonardo DiCaprio, that they are of course making an incredible work, and that it should be more recognized. And the second and last step should be mitigation, as I have mentioned. Gradually decreasing greenhouse gases levels, especially by changing our industry models and stopping the use of fossil fuels like coal. We do not really have a choice here, but it has to be done. The faster, the better.
Thank you, Daniel. We talked about the steps, but I also want to pay your attention to the gaps. And GAIA, I want to turn to you here. You represent the UK as the youth delegate. Where do you see gaps in government's responses, and what are the reasons for these gaps?
Okay. Well, there's always a perennial gap between what governments promise versus what is needed to fully mitigate the impacts of climate change. And this is seen most significantly with vulnerable countries and communities. So when we look at how governments have failed to respond to climate summits throughout the years, we see that time and time again, it comes down to a lack of political will and the conflicts and contradictions that hinder action. So these gaps in government responses are not for lack of science or evidence. And we can understand the climate crisis as fundamentally a collective action problem. So we continue to see governments emphasizing domestic political interests over international pressure in driving climate policy, from issues such as the phasing out or phasing down of coal to questions of financial flows for loss and damage and adaptation and mitigation. And at its heart, and I'm glad that you mentioned trust, multilateral action takes trust. So for vulnerable countries in the global south, as well as youth and civil society, this marks a breakdown of the very trust needed for a cohesive and collective response to climate change.
Thanks, Gaia, for your remarks. Sophia, I want to turn to you now. You specialized in refugees and migration policies. We've been hearing about climate refugees recently, and 1 billion people are estimated to be climate refugees by 2050. Can you tell us a little bit about climate refugees and who are these people?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think it's really important to talk about climate refugees because so far it's not a term that is official in the UNHCR. I think it's also important to talk about people in general who have been displaced because of climate change, because climate refugees are only the people who cross international borders, but there are many more people who are being displaced within their own countries. It's a really important issue to focus in on because so many conflicts in the world and so many issues are linked to climate. So we can even look at the Syrian refugee crisis. From 2006 to 2010, Syria actually was suffering one of the worst droughts in history, which made about 60% of the land in Syria, turned it into a desert. About 80% of the cattle in the country died, and then you had a migration of 1.5 million farmers going into the cities. And in that same time, people wanted to dig wells, but the country was giving preferences to certain sects within Islam to dig wells. And so this created illegal wells being dug, and then further the aquifers were becoming even more depleted. And I just say this as an example of how climate difficulties can really make conflicts, can really exacerbate conflicts. And so I think there really is a great importance of finally putting climate refugees into the spotlight and saying this is a reason why people move. I think there might be two main reasons why climate refugees have not been given the spotlight. I think there still is a lack of political will to recognize them because it requires more funding, it requires more policies to address the plight of climate refugees. I think it also is difficult to narrow to identify refugees who have just fled because of climate. Because like I mentioned, climate usually is an extra factor why people flee. However, there are people who flee just because of climate. So it really is something that it is a term, and it is a group of people that we definitely need to focus on.
You talked about conflict, Sophia. I just want to follow up on that briefly.
Sure.
Do you think that's a source of concern for international peace and security as well?
Climate
Yes.
related to conflict, definitely. Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think that, I think whenever there is the flight of refugees and migrants, we always see the clash between host countries and the refugees that are arriving. I think one way for us to mitigate this conflict is, I believe there needs to be an improvement in early warning strategies. I know this sounds a little strange, but if we are able to improve early warning that there is some sort of climate disaster that is coming, people are actually able to prepare themselves better to flee. People are actually able to hold on to more of their assets, and wherever they're able to flee, they can actually have more cash at hand, more assets available to thrive more wherever they're going. I was looking at some statistics recently. If we're able to give a 24-hour warning, people are able to save 30% of their assets. If you're able to give them a 48-hour warning, they're able to save 50%. And so it really, really makes a difference. When there was a cyclone, I think it was Bonnie, which hit Bangladesh in the 1970s. The cyclone, there really wasn't a warning when it hit. It killed 300,000 people. In 2019, Cyclone Fani hit Bangladesh, and only 5 people died because of that cyclone, because over the years, the country really was able to improve its early warning, its resilience, and so I think, yeah, as time has gone by, we're able to have better responses and prepare people for, if they do have to move, to be able to move with, at least with, some of their assets.
Thank you, Sophia. Let's come back to the UN here, speaking of the international peace and security. Cynthia, I'd like to ask this question to you. Can you tell us what actions can be taken on a UN level? And how do you also bridge the gap between the youth and the United Nations?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to start with the second question, which is about bridging that gap. So at the beginning of my term as the U.S. Youth Observer, I conducted a national listening tour where I personally spoke with and met with hundreds of U.S. youth from across the nation. And I heard about the priorities that they care about the most. What I found is that about 40% of participants said that climate action is the greatest challenge that they think faces the globe. So we see that U.S. youth care about SDG 13 and they want to take action. And more importantly, they shared to me how the climate crisis has personally affected their lives and what they're doing to advocate for it. So in terms of engaging with youth, what I also found during my listening tour is that young people tend to support the UN, but it feels like this disconnected entity where they feel like they don't know where their place is. They don't know how to get that seat at the table or how to enter and get into the door. So what I really admire about this administration with the United States is that Ambassador Mills recently gave a speech about increasing accessibility to the United Nations, how he wants to empower everyone everywhere to be able to have that stake and become a stakeholder with the UN. In my work as the U.S. Youth Observer, I am trying to actively work on initiatives to get young people to the table and bring them those opportunities to directly engage with climate action and speak to UN leaders. So that includes working with the UNA USA and the UN Foundation to set up a meeting with the UN General Assembly President to discuss what U.S. youth are doing on climate action. In terms of the previous question, which is, and could you repeat the question as well?
Sure. Can you tell us what actions can be taken on a UN level?
Absolutely. So in my role as the U.S. Youth Observer, I work a lot with the UN Youth Delegate Program. And every single day we're working on ways that the UN can be more accessible to youth. And so one part of it is including that youth voice, bringing in as many voices as possible. SDG 17 is all about partnerships. And the reality is we cannot attain action unless we bring in every single person and have everything represented. And what the UN can do is it is the only organization and entity that exists that can bring 193 member states and discuss these global issues that impact all of us. So whether I've spent the last 2 years researching the impacts of the SDGs and non-compulsory treaties like the Paris Climate Accords and how they impact international climate litigation. I've looked at every single case that has ever been settled in the entire globe on climate litigation, and I found that in 2016, when the UN came together and started to implement the SDGs and push them forward and have the Paris Climate Accords, there was a 30% jump in the global north in successful environmental cases. So we see that even with these voluntary treaties and voluntary goals, there is action that is happening and statistically significant action that ends up reverberating into domestic countries and their legislation and their national policies. So I see so many ways that the UN can engage with youth and then also engage with individual member states to take action on climate.
Thank you, Cynthia. We talked about governments, we talked about the UN's role and younger generations. If we go back to Glasgow, there were also religious leaders representing Christians, Muslims, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhists, calling for concrete action to fight climate change. And Pope Francis has also been very outspoken about climate change. And I want to ask here, what role can faith leaders play? And Daniel, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, perfect. Let me start by saying that faith leaders play a very, very important role in advocating and speaking in just one voice. In the era of disinformation, cynicism, and competing interest, it is important that most opinion leaders and influencers share the same message. Political leadership need to take into consideration many aspects and confronting interest, but faith leaders have the possibility to focus on long-term vision and share interests of all humanity. They need to continue being part of the activism and also serve as, so to say, guardians of conscience for decision makers. They need to continue being part of the push campaign started primarily by the youth. They also carry the additional leverage, credibility, and authority that needs to be mobilized, for example, in support of the youth activism efforts. As you have mentioned, these also include the Holy Father, Pope Francis himself. His encyclical, which I have here, I carry on with me, Laudato Si, in English means praise be to you, and is regarded as a worldwide wake-up call to help humanity understand the destruction that humans are rendering to the environment and other fellow humans. This is never enough to suck such wake-ups, especially if they come from such a high spiritual and moral authority like the Holy Father. It is so crucial because it puts emphasis on scientific consensus that changes in the climate are largely made by us, humans. And more, it is blaming apathy, the reckless pursuit of profits, excessive faith in technology, and political short-sightedness. I really believe these important messages should be even more amplified still through they were rating already before the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. But they have not lost any of their relevance till now.
All right, thanks, Daniel. Sofia, you mentioned about $100 billion funding at the beginning. I'd like to discuss that a bit more. Developing nations have lower emissions, but are still bearing the brunt of global warming through severe heat waves, droughts, floods, and most of these vulnerable countries do not have the financial sources to adapt to climate change. And COP26, if we go back to the summit, failed to deliver $100 billion climate finance for these countries. Who do you think should pay for it, and when does inaction become an international concern?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much for that question. I think that this is our planet, and so I think everyone needs to contribute to a common pot. I think probably different countries will contribute more and others less, especially the countries that definitely are the most responsible for the emissions around the world, and who, the consequences are being borne by countries that we're really not causing as many emissions. So I think there is a sense that we need to have a sense of global solidarity, that this is our planet, but not look at solidarity in just around a certain cause. But I think the true meaning of solidarity is my fate is bound to your fate. And so you are human just as I am human. And so what I do, what will make me thrive will also make you thrive. So I want to appeal to the moral courage of leaders who can look at the policies that their countries have and to see if their countries are really making other ones suffer. So appealing to that moral courage so that they can reverse their decisions and make the right choice. I also think that there was a lot of debate at COP26 about this funding, like would the money come in grants? Would it come in loans? Like what would it look like? And even though this was a lot of talk and like, okay, we want to see action, I do think that the talk is important, because what we definitely want to avoid in this case is another kind of, climate colonialism. I don't know what it could be, but that each country is able to come up with its own response to the climate factors that it is facing, so I think that there is the role that the the developed countries play needs to be one of really accompanying the G77 and all other nations in the world, respecting their autonomy, but also being present to them. How could this happen? Well, maybe this pot won't be formed by the next COP, but I think an interesting form of cooperation is triangular cooperation. So potentially thinking about the skills and the funding that countries in the global north have, and pairing those with countries in the global south, and maybe within groups rather than just one pot that people apply for, but rather making these groups of countries that are paired based on their skills and based on their needs. That could be a way of addressing the problem in a smaller way. But I think there needs to be, the big thing I'll say is just global solidarity, but true solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sophia. Let's talk about billionaires. And Gaia, I want to turn to you here. Some of them have been criticized for joyriding to space by the UN Secretary General. And recently, just before COP26, Prince William's also suggested billionaires invest more time and, of course, more money in saving Earth instead of finding the next place to go and live. Should they?
Well, firstly, let's be clear that when we think about climate change, and I'm glad Sophia brought this up, we have to understand it as an issue that's fundamentally rooted in the severe disparities of wealth and inequality, both within and between nations, and in the longer histories of colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation. So the climate crisis today has been exacerbated by the system of capitalism, which is designed to extract as many resources as possible from nature and to encourage the overconsumption for economic gain. So when we're thinking about billionaires, we have to see them within this context, and powerful companies, of which billionaires profit on and are produced by, lie at the heart of this extractive, ecologically damaging system. The top 8 billionaires have more wealth than half the human race, and the richest 1% of the world account for 15% of emissions. In comparison, this is nearly twice as much as the world's poorest 50. So as you mentioned, there's been a lot of hype over the recent actions of billionaires to earmark a relatively tiny portion of their wealth into climate mitigation. We can see Jeff Bezos with his 10 billion Earth Fund, Bill Gates with 2 billion, and Elon Musk tweeting that he would donate 100 million for carbon capture technology, which actually has been proven to be just trees. But while mobilizing private finance to support the transition to net zero is a step in the right direction, that these are investments that don't challenge the existing systems and concentrations of wealth and power that we have to address in order to combat this issue. And billionaires could similarly support investments in environmental and social protection through paying their appropriate share of taxes.
Thank you, Gaia. We talked about what is needed to fight climate change. Cynthia, I want to turn to you here. Are there examples of successful government responses, either on a local or federal level?
Absolutely. So at least with the United States, I know that our president is actively working to build back better. And part of that initiative is trying to meet a goal of reducing our emissions by 50 to 52%. Compared to our 2005 levels here in the United States. So that is an active promise from the U.S. federal government. And then locally, we see that a lot of governments are responding directly to the pleas of youth activists around the United States and around the world as well. When I was on my listening tour, I met a young man from Iowa, which is a rural state in the middle of the United States. And they generally, because they're a landlocked state, haven't faced the same impacts of climate change as places like Louisiana, which are right on the coast. And yet he told me that when he was 8 years old, they faced the worst flood that they had ever experienced in 1,000 years. Over a decade later, he says that it still smells like the flood when you walk through the streets. You still see homes that were destroyed by it. You still see people whose lives were shattered because of it. After this flood, he united with his friends to rally their local government and tell them that climate change is real. It is impacting their local town in Iowa, and they actually encouraged and got the local government to successfully adopt clean energy initiatives within that local government. I've met so many other young people in the United States who have advocated to their governments to implement clean energy initiatives and to curb their carbon emissions. on a global level, we see cases such as the Ligari case, where farmers and grassroots advocates are suing their governments for failing to do anything about climate change or exacerbating it. And we've seen them win. Even in Colombia, we had a group of youth climate activists who sued their government and successfully held them accountable and have created tangible steps towards attaining more climate action. So we see that there are many different routes that people at a grassroots level are taking to create climate action. And I think another important thing to note is that environmental protections and environmental rights are in about 70% of the world's constitutions. And so these are things that have been promised to the people, and people are just asking for the things that are constitutionally their rights.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. From governments to civil society, younger generations, private sector, faith leaders, we all have a role to play, obviously, to fight climate change. But also, there are climate change deniers out there. So my question is, to each of you, what is your message to those who do not believe in climate change? Sophia.
I would say, tell me more. Because honestly, I think it's good to understand where people come from. And people have many different reasons to believe what they believe. And I think we can always improve our arguments when we hear what other people have to say. So I think, tell me more, and then I know exactly, I'm better able to respond to them.
Daniel?
Yeah, in my case, of course, we cannot speak for everyone, but the claims of climate change deniers often stem from their economic interests. Even if the changes in the climate are becoming impossible to ignore, the deniers point out of natural warming and cooling of the planet throughout history and try to minimize the responsibility of human activities with the aim of countering business as usual. However, scientific evidence that the causes of climate change are anthropogenic is overwhelming. I believe if deniers cannot accept that climate change or climate crisis is real, trying to forcefully change their opinion would only create more tension and politicization. The best strategy, I think, is to tirelessly share scientific evidence and promote sustainable economic models, including through our efforts at the UN, the only universal global organization. Its convening power remains crucial and irreplaceable. I think that the general public in the world has been sensitized quite enough by now, including by many tireless youth activists and social media influencers. The deniers seem to be losing ground, hopefully. We should not underestimate them, but at the same time, we cannot get discouraged by them at all. On the contrary, we should stay the course, spare no effort in fighting climate change, remain vigilant, and do not take anything for granted. Deniers are often also populist and adventurists. When they see that the public opinion moves away in another direction, they could gradually start changing their opinion and their narratives, hopefully. Or to use music terminology, they could start singing from a different song sheet.
Gaia, what do you have to say?
I really like your point about listening to communities. I think in order to combat climate change, we have to understand the different perspectives, the different ideas that different people are approaching an issue with. But that being said, we understand that so many climate deniers are from positions of privilege or wish to maintain their status of economic power and gain. And in that sense, I think that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence and what more can be done at this point.
Thank you, Gaia. Cynthia? Cynthia, what message do you have?
I would say take a look out the window. We have reached a point where everybody everywhere is being impacted by the climate crisis. There is no longer a point where we can deny what is actually happening to us. I think that some of my colleagues have brought up a great point, which is that we need to listen to all perspectives. But that being said, you can't deny science. You can't deny what almost every single scientist in the world agrees with and says is happening. The fact is climate change is happening right now. It's hurting our children. It's hurting our future generations. It's hurting everyone everywhere. And we must all unite together to actively address it. I mean, if you took a look at a bridge that was hanging over 100 meters into the air and 98% of the world scientists said to not step on it because it was too dangerous, I would bet all of my net worth, which isn't a lot, but I would bet everything that a rational person would not even set foot onto that bridge. And yet we have this metaphorical bridge that is over all of our heads, and there are still people who are willing to take that step on the bridge. We can't let that happen. We can't let people step onto this bridge when it means putting future generations at risk. And so I would encourage them to listen to scientists, take a look out the window, see what they can do to make tomorrow better than today.
Thank you, Cynthia. All right. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for fighting for a better world. Last but not least, I'd like to thank to the Sovereign Order of Malta Permanent Observer Mission to the UN in New York, Ambassador Dr. Paul Beresford-HILL and his team for hosting this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My sincere thanks to BETÜL YÜRÜK, UN International News Correspondent, for so ably managing this conversation, and of course, my gratitude to our 4 panelists for their impressive and their powerful contributions. As we embark on 2022, I think that the takeaway from this discussion is the need for all of us to make not just a New Year's resolution, but rather a generational resolution, one that encourages us to join with young people across the world, not to lecture them, but to listen to them and to encourage them to share their views and opinions, and then to enter into a dialogue of mutual respect. Each year, hundreds of thousands of young people volunteer to help their fellow human beings. Whether it be working with refugees, soup kitchens, aid centers, providing first aid support throughout the world through national and international ambulance associations, or just spending time with the elderly and the sick, the level of commitment of the next generation is truly remarkable. But youth is often undervalued because we who are older consider ourselves to be wiser. The lessons of contemporary as well as ancient history should disabuse us of any notion that we know better just because age has embraced us. I'm reminded of the words of Pope Francis when he recently addressed a gathering of young people in Rome following COP26. He said this to them: "Be free and authentic. Be the critical conscience of society. Don't be afraid to criticize. We need your criticism. Many of you, for example, are critical of environmental pollution and of those who ignore the consequences of climate change. But we need you to give us your voice. Be free in criticism. Be passionate about truth, so that with your dreams you can say, 'My life is not captive to the mindset of the world. I am free because I strive for justice, love, and peace.'" Well, let this be part of our generational resolution. The Permanent Observer Mission of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations in New York thanks you so much for allowing us to share this dialogue with you, and we in turn urge you to share it with colleagues and friends. We wish you peace and good health.